Palatse. I'm a researcher at the Institute for Economic Justice, and we'll be convening this conversation with two phenomenal thinkers, where we will be unpacking what we mean by advancing a feminist economy. What does a feminist economy look like? A question that feminists and feminist economists in particular have long engaged with this question and have long researched this question. As we know, the economic damage caused by the pandemic is said to have far-reaching effects over the next few years, an added burden to an already crippled global economy, and the precarity of women's livelihoods in particularly Black women and women of color, is one of the defining features of many economic outcomes, South Africa included. And yet the dynamics that perpetuate gender inequalities remains marginal to economic discourses and economic policymaking in particular. However, the onset of the pandemic has in many ways surfaced a number of alternatives that we once deemed almost impossible prior to the pandemic. And so this webinar series is the first of 3 webinars we will be convening, and part of the objective of the webinars is to not only collaborate with other feminists engaged in social and economic issues, economic justice issues, but also to imagine collectively what a feminist economy looks like. And so we will explore the challenges and opportunities for a feminist economy. And over the course of the next 3 weeks, we hope to provide a clearer articulation of feminists' alternatives. So I'm delighted to host today Natalia Flores Garrido and Nomahlubi Jakuja. Welcome, guys. And I'll give you a brief bio of each. Nomahlubi has worked on a variety of projects, including developing a financial inclusion strategy for a leading African bank in 12 countries, and the SADC Secretariat. She has conducted research on mitigation strategies in South Africa and managed the UN Sustainable Food Systems Program, and developed a low-cost strategy for antenatal and postnatal classes in South Africa. Natalia is a doctoral student at the Sociology and Anthropology Department at the Nelson Mandela University. She holds a master's degree in sociology by the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences in Mexico City. She has extensive experience working on gender studies as an academic and also as an activist involved in collective feminist projects. Her latest publication, which I'm particularly excited about, is a paper on precarity from a feminist perspective, a note on 3 elements for the political struggle, which is published in the Review of Radical Political Economics. So for those who are joining us, feel free to send through your comments while we have this conversation. We expect to end it by 2 p.m. First, however, I would like us to reflect a little bit on what we mean by advancing a feminist economy, what this means for us, and what the current moment presents, if any, opportunities for change. And I'll start with you, Nomahlubi. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Let me start by sharing a few slides with you that almost like paint a picture of where we at and where we came from before COVID. And let me just share my screen. So that was the current picture before entering COVID of where women stood globally in terms of when we look at the workforce, in terms of female contribution to labor versus their contribution to GDP, in other words, their income. And on average, if you tally all of that across the globe, women contribute about 40% towards the labor force, but only contribute about 36% towards the GDP. And then we also had, if you're looking at access to capital, and that's in especially small, medium enterprises, where women had a funding gap of, female-owned companies had a funding gap of $320 billion. And then if you go to now, sort of what has been crafted for on a funding, on an investing, a gender investing lens, and what needs to be tackled, it's bridging that finance gap that I talked about. And this was before we even hit COVID. And it's also bridging that women's contribution to labor versus their income, their contribution to GDP. And this means we need products in terms of financing that are targeted at women. And we also need policies that speak and focus primarily on women. And before I even go on a gloom picture, but just to share one country that has managed to actually utilize this window of opportunity that has opened to reform their policies to make sure that they explicitly speak to women and address all of these challenges that I've just pointed out. In Hawaii in July, they became the first world to explicitly commit to involving and prioritizing women and gender equality in its COVID-19 recovery strategy plan. And according to some studies as well, if we continue to ignore the challenges that women faced as a result of COVID and don't do anything, we have the potential of economic losses of up to $5 trillion US dollars that will come as a result of this. And also this is because it is not just the health system, right, that was affected by COVID-19 and that needs to recover. But one thing that COVID did very well, at least for me, was to highlight some of the economic fault lines in our economies and our social systems, which continue to put women at a greater disadvantage. And then before I even go any further, let me unpack some of the terminology that we've come to know very well during this time, which let's start with shutdown. What did that shutdown mean? When you look, it meant businesses had to close temporarily in other parts of the world for a period of time. And also when you look at some of the industries that were affected by the shutdown, they were mainly low-paying industries, which are predominantly women. And a study that was done by Professor Larry Schmidt from MIT actually found that during this COVID time, the most affected population were young women with children, because they're the ones who form part of that labor force in the low-paying income. And this is not just in the US, but across the globe. And also what the pandemic brought with it were new terms. When you look at things like telecommuting, we also saw the inequality that exists even within different sectors, where other sectors could afford to telecommute and work from home using supporting infrastructure to do that. But many of the industries where women are based, if you look at hospitality industry, if you look at domestic workers, there's no telecommunicating that was that could support the type of work that they do. And therefore, in any recovery plan, you can't ignore the impact it has had on women. Even before COVID, the whole economic system, it has always placed women at a disadvantage. And right now, coupled with the addition of about $5 trillion US dollars that will impact economies as a result of ignoring women during this time, we have to craft strategies and policies that explicitly put women at the fore of the policy making and seek to address all of these challenges that have always existed. If you look at the contribution to GDP level, increasing women's income, if you look at financing and investing, making sure that we're targeting women-owned SMMEs in terms of funding and creating those funding institutions for women. And also, if you look at it just in terms of services and products that are offered, that we make sure that we target women as our main target audience. And for me, I think this is where COVID-19 really, if we don't take this as a window of opportunity to address our economies, we would have lost out on what I believe is the third biggest opportunity that has hit economies in terms of offering a chance to structure their economies post-World War I and World War II. And I think what the main advantage of COVID is, it has highlighted nicely the perspective of the victims and those who suffered greatly as a result of this pandemic. And it has shone the spotlight on them, allowing all policymakers around the world not to ignore the voices of the victims during this time around. And yeah, over to you, Sonia.
Thanks, Lumi. And I like what you said about really the structural issues in our economy that need to fundamentally change for this to, not be a missed opportunity, as you say. I'll now hand over the floor to Natalia on her reflections.
Thank you so much, Sonia, and for inviting me and for having me here. I think this is a very interesting conversation. So when you said previously, what do we mean by feminist economics? And I will say that feminist economics is about radical transformation of everything that is wrong with this system. So I will read a little bit my presentation just to use better these 10 minutes, and then after that we can engage in conversation. So the economic crisis created by COVID-19 has revealed something intrinsic to the capitalist system in which we live, that this system is based on the political organization of precarity as a condition of human existence. In social sciences, there has been a growing debate about the concept of precarity, understood in two different ways. The first one is related to precariousness as a condition of human existence and human bodies. This means that all of us as human beings are in lack of control over the conditions that guarantee our survival. Our bodies can be harmed very easily due to accidents, illness, or physical violence. Some scholars like Judith Butler have advanced a political agenda based on the ethics of nonviolence as a result of the acknowledgement of the condition of precariousness of the human body and the state of vulnerability in which we live that makes us dependent on one another. The second understanding of precarity refers to transformations in the labor market, especially under the neoliberal regime and the way in which working conditions have been worsening alongside the dismantling of a leftist project aimed at the transformation of the capitalist conditions of working and living. It seems like neoliberalism has imposed upon us not only certain economic policies, but that it has also acted as an ideological force that has colonized our imagination. This means that today, speaking about a leftist project that can give more power to the working population and promote a bigger redistribution of resources through the state in the form of welfare policies, is immediately considered an impossibility, something that cannot be done without putting at risk what we are told should be more valuable, like economic growth and productivity. The crisis of COVID-19 has put together these two understandings of precarity in a very obvious way. It has reminded us as human beings of our condition of vulnerability and interdependence. We are not only economic subjects that produce and consume, we are embodied subjects. I think this is one of the biggest flaws of orthodox thinking in the economic discipline, the denial of the bodily aspect of the human experience, or the understanding of the body only as an instrument of the productive and reproductive processes. COVID-19 has reminded us about our condition as bodies and about the vulnerability of the human body, how it can be affected by something like a virus, but as some people has been saying, how there are things out of the control of humanity in general. And this is something that we should take very seriously in the light of climate change and the increasing vulnerability of the human body under the changing conditions of our planet. But COVID-19 has also highlighted precarity in its political sense, in the way that even though all human beings have a vulnerable body, this vulnerability is unequally distributed. And how even though as human beings we cannot be 100% protected, some people and some bodies are more protected than others, and some bodies have the infrastructure needed to their support and survival. In these months, we have seen precisely that, how some bodies or lives have had access to healthcare or the possibility to stay at home, and how even staying at home, there are differences in the way in which the body inhabits that space. It is not the same to stay at home having your own bedroom and a big garden than staying at home sharing with more people and without the necessary resources to be in a good mental and physical space during 5 months of not being able to socialize. For this reason, I think that one of the concepts that could be useful for us to think about more livable futures is the idea of the body and of our existence as embodied subjects. If we do an exercise of imagination and we ask ourselves, how will a system should be in order to protect the body and to guarantee the well-being of the bodies? To think about this will necessarily lead us to put in first place the essential infrastructure that allows the sustenance of the physical material body. That means that all people should have access to housing, food, and healthcare. Because these things are essential to the protection of the body, it should be guaranteed that all citizens have access to them. And the only way to do this is by providing universal public services of housing, food, and healthcare. I am not very familiar with the particular policies that the South African government has taken in this respect, but I know that in many countries, governments have deployed during the last months a much stronger intervention on the public economy than they had previously done. This shows that it's possible to advocate for a stronger participation of the government in the economy, and that this should guarantee at least the basic infrastructure to take care of the bodily needs of the citizens. As feminists, we are aware of the importance of the body in our experience as social subjects. At the end, gender studies and feminist theory have been largely concerned about how our bodies become gendered and what is the relationship between bodies, subjectivities, and power in society. In this regard, I would like to suggest that to think about the body will also imply to consider the specific tasks that are directed to satisfy our bodily needs. This being an essential dimension of domestic and care work, as a group of activities oriented to taking care of the body of others. As human beings, we all need to be taken care of during our lives, but specifically in some moments like childhood, old age, or when we are sick and cannot be fully independent. This again shows a characteristic that starts with the body, but that could suggest some clues to reorganize the economic and political system. In this regard, the fact that we are born and we are probably will die needing other people to our own sustenance highlights the interdependence in which we are forced to live as human beings. This contradicts classical and neoclassical theories in the economics that imagine economic subjects as autonomous, individual subjects that only care about their own interest and their own well-being. It is somehow funny how these exercises of imagination are accepted and respected in our discipline, but all ideas linked to radical transformations of the economic system are disregarded precisely due to their excessive levels of fantasy and impossibility. But what idea can be more impossible and fantastic than the idea of human beings as independent and disembodied entities that do not need others in order to survive? And we have seen that in a very concrete way during the last months, how children, old people, and sick people are dependent on the care of others. But beyond that, how we are all dependent on each other and how survival has always been a collective task. What would it mean to translate this into economic theory and the economic system? It would perhaps mean that as much as basic infrastructure to sustain the body should be guaranteed to everyone, the same should be demanded with regards to the right to receive care and to give care. This implies moving beyond dichotomous understandings of care work as exclusively an obstacle to the full participation of women in the labor market, and understand it instead as an essential activity and a human right. And here it is important to say that we should all have the right to receive care as much as the right to give care or take care of others. Some authors like Joan Tronto have suggested that we should move towards a caring democracy. As she asserts, and quote, democratic life rests upon the presumption that citizens are equal. What is distinctive about democratic caring, though, is that it presumes that we are equal as democratic citizens in being care receivers. This quality of being needy is shared equally by all humans, end of quote. What form will a caring democracy take? In this regard, I think it is indispensable to talk about the creation of a national care system that could help to organize and understand caring activities as a collective process and not as a residual service that families should provide. And we know that by saying families, we're mostly saying women. At the end, to think about a reorganization of the system, thinking about the body, means to think about a system whose goal is the sustainability of life in a broader sense. For now, COVID-19 has allowed us to think about survival, about death, loss, and shared vulnerabilities. In this regard, we should consider all that threatens the sustainability of life. Climate change, the finishing of resources that we all need to survive like water, the unequal distribution of these resources and risks, and at the end, capitalism as a system that attacks life, that constricts the possibilities of survival, and that tries to dismantle the solidarities and collectivities that for centuries have ensured the survival of communities. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Natalia. What was that? No, thank you. That was really an amazing contribution, and I liked how you framed it. Framed this issue of what does a feminist economy look like as about radical transformation. And I just wanted to build a little bit on that. So based on your research on precarity and understanding how the pandemic has increased precarity, particularly in our bodies, embodied bodies, as you refer to, do you think that we can reverse this precarity without changing our current system or our current structures, or the way that our current economy is structured, rather? Referring to mostly our capitalist kind of neoliberal economy.
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. As much as we can say, like we could deploy like certain public policies to alleviate like the precarity of the most precarious groups in society. And I would say that that's urgent, right? We need to do that because people are literally dying because they don't have access to these very material and very concrete resources to survive. And so I would say that's one dimension or one possible path, like to really do some things that are like urgent. Like I was reading this morning in the newspapers that in the UK, I think next week we'll finish this special policy that people could not be evicted if they weren't paying rent because of the pandemic. By government, they were protected. But that measure is gonna end, I think, next week. So that started a conversation about housing as a human right? Because if you don't have a house and if you don't have money to pay for your house, then you literally have no place to live. So I think there should be some policies like very focused on these kinds of things. And I would say, like, as I mentioned, that for me, the basic infrastructure will be housing, food, and healthcare, because that's the very, very, very basic that we need to protect our bodies and the physical survival of our bodies, right? And then in the second place, on the other hand, I would say that would be like something focused and something urgent to do right now. But thinking about in the long term, we definitely need to change the system, right? Capitalism is based on the precarity of the bodies and the precarity of the working class and the precarity of us as human beings, that all that we have to survive is our body and our work. So that will always create this thing of, if you don't have access to work, or if you can't work, then you don't have the right to survive, right? You don't have the right to be protected. So I will say that, yes, at the end, what we need to dismantle is capitalism, that threatens human life, and not only human life, like the conditions of the planet, climate change, all these changes in the environment that production and productivity has created is something that we really need to think about survival in economy, right?
Yeah. Thank you. And I want to turn to Hlubi now. And just, you spoke a little bit about the fault lines in our economy, which both you and Natalia have I think, done a really good job at articulating for us. Do you think, Hlubi, that this current moment gives us, gives us an opportunity to advance our feminist alternatives, and if so, in what ways?
Okay, before I answer that question, Sonia, I'd just like to add on to the previous discussion. As you guys were talking, I had some thoughts. And I think for me, having had practical experience in the policy landscape and in South Africa and in some parts of the world, I think when we talk about because we have to acknowledge that capitalism is a system that's alive and well, that is being transported across the globe through various institutions and various mechanisms. So I think every time I hear the discourse around can the current system meet the obligations and the needs of the 50% that are currently left out of the economy, no. But when we come up with radical solutions, it's important to also ask questions on who is tasked with abolishing the system, who must come up with these radical solutions and changes. Is it that 50% that's currently not seated in rooms? Is it us intellectuals and policymakers? And I think, and also when we walk into those organizations and institutions, are we talking in a uniform voice? Because then we also have many different voices that are not articulating one meaning. And I think for me, as a way forward and in thinking about radical change, we also need to think about the organization that comes up. And if you think about many other systems and revolutions and how they came about, there was a certain level of organization and uniformity in voice and in that radicalism that came with them. And for me, I feel like at this point in time, we all speaking in different voices, whether it's under the ecology voice or it's under the feminist voice, but all of us are advocating and acknowledging that the current system is not meeting our needs. And we need some form of way of organizing ourselves and coming together, whether you call yourself a feminist, an ecologist, or whatever form or shape. And then once that uniformity and organization exists, then we will be able to challenge a system that is so deeply entrenched in society and is so well organized. And I think, Sonia, then to your next question on, sorry, what was the question? I've digressed a bit.
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to kind of unpack what you think this current moment means, and whether, you know, just based on your response now, whether you think this is a moment for us to organize around a uniform voice, as you call it.
So for me, I think the most important thing, at least that's coming out and resonating very deep with me around this COVID-19 time, is really how, based on just your sheer station in society, how you are already placed at a disadvantage, not having access to good health, not having access to ventilators, and you're already placed at a huge disadvantage of surviving the pandemic. And then just by sheer finding yourself on the other side of the spectrum, where you can afford to stay from home, you have a big garden, there's no mental health issues that you have to deal with because you have all of these other outlets, not all of your distractions have been taken away. And also if you look at the body and how the GBV numbers shot up during the COVID time, because people are confined in one bedroom spaces and there aren't any distractions and outlets where they can go and vent, while others still had access to some of those distractions, right? So I think for me, one of the things that has come out is really how unequal our society is and how we cannot continue and accepting it for what it is, but we have to challenge it in whatever form or shape or space you're in. And I am skeptical sometimes when I listen to policymakers who are eager to jump in and go back to the norm and start talking about the normal and implementing the policies as we did before. And for me, I feel like we need to hear more voices from activists, more voices that will challenge the status quo, because if we let things and policymakers go back to our neoliberal practices post-COVID-19 without putting forward a strong feminist agenda or strong feminist ecological agenda, we would have missed a great opportunity, because this is the time to push back. We've seen it. If Hawaii can do it, a tiny country, I'm almost certain South Africa can do it as well. We saw it with the pushback with the basic, with the unemployment fund during this time, where activists were able to write to the president to say, no, you have to pay the certain amount for people that are currently excluded in the economy. If they fall sick, how are they going to buy medication when they currently have no income? And we need that strong pushback before we rush into opening our economy, rush into going back to the normal. And we also need a clearly articulated picture of what that new normal is, because sometimes it's not that people and policymakers are resistant to change, it's that we don't put forward a clear picture of what that new change looks like. And if we can craft it and draft it in a form of a COVID-19 recovery plan for South Africa, that we as feminists in this group are sitting, we draft that policy and we push it forward, we put it and we tabled it to government. That way they cannot say they don't know what those policies are meant to look like, what they meant to speak to, because we have given them that solution.
Yeah, and speaking of defining a feminist alternatives and having that as a unified voice around, but also understanding the persistence of neoliberalism, right, and understanding the persistence of the current structure. I wonder, Natalia, if you feel that there are certain feminist alternatives that we can build power around now, and whether you think building power around dismantling capitalism or neoliberalism in itself is too far-fetched, and they're more closer, or what's the term, closer fruits to grab onto now.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Luby, for all your comments. I think it's very valuable. Thank you so much for that point on the body and gender-based violence. I think that's another thing that it's really connected to what I wanted to present and to all these conditions that we are experiencing now. And it's also connected to the economy, right? Like all these things and processes that happen in the body and through the body are obviously have a very direct connection with the economic system and how we organize to survive and to produce and to reproduce society. And before I answer to your question, Sonia, I just wanted to add to what Luby was saying previously about how can we organize and in looking for this radical transformation and obviously the difficulties to organize a big social movement, because even though we are seeing and experiencing like this system is not sustainable, like how this system is really affecting us in very obvious ways. I think one of the I wouldn't say good things about COVID-19, but one of the opportunities, as Luby was saying, is that it has shown in a very obvious way like these inequalities in society, right? It's undeniable now. But how do we organize to challenge this, to transform this system? And I would say like two things, like just related to that very quickly. And the first one is like this idea or this space for imagination, right? Because we are all the time, we are being told like, no, this is not possible. You cannot even imagine to live in a society that is not capitalist, right? And that's, as economists, we are very aware of that, what is possible and what is not possible, right? Maybe, and how neoliberalism is also a project of colonization of the imagination, right? When you ask for more intervention of the state and the government in these welfare policies, you are immediately told by other economists, supporters of this orthodoxy, like this is not possible, this will affect like the growth of the economy, the national economy, where does the money are gonna come from? Like if you say like we need more public policies, but we don't have money, we are already in a recession, blah, 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 like all these things that really are telling you like it is not possible to imagine anything more than this, right? And I will ask like, is this really the best we can have? Like, is this really the only system in which we can live? So maybe we kind of start by challenging these ideas, in imagining new ideas, imagining new ways of organizing society. And then the second thing that I wanted to say is that this slogan of think globally, act locally, right? And it makes a lot of sense to think about neoliberalism and capitalism, as Luby was saying, as this global process imposed in all the countries in all the world practically. And how can we think about this as a global historical process, but also to think about alternatives locally rooted, right? Like in the communities, in the local practices, in the culture of the people. Like, how can we manage like these two dimensions of the global and the local at the same time? I think that will be another challenge to think about feminist economics. And maybe answering your question, maybe that's where we can have some power to really change things, is going back to the communities and to work with the communities. And I think that's something very important that we should do, like to go and talk and see and really try to understand how can we act locally and in localized communities.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting how you say that you know, in many ways, the current system has policed our imagination and the space for ideation as it is. And I do honestly feel like COVID has presented a space for our imagination to be broadened. So for example, currently discussions on the care economy in particular have come out as, you know, something that is a viable alternative, something that visibilizes women and women's participation in the economy. And I wonder if you can speak a little, because you did talk a little about it in your initial presentation, Natalia, around the care economy and what this means for women's participation in the economy.
Yeah, I think that the care economy is very important, and I know that the most orthodox approach to the care in the care work is to place it as an obstacle for the full participation of women into the labor market, which is very true and it's very real. Like, we have seen that now in a very obvious way. Like, some of my closest friends and people in my family, because they're women, they have to stop working. Because now that in Mexico, the kids are not back to school, right? So they have to stay at home and they have to study at home. And the classes are from 9 to 3 o'clock. So like in this case with this family, some of my family, because she was working obviously, but she was earning less than her husband, as the labor market works. You know, we know like women earn less than men. And someone needed to take care of the children. So they decided, well, obviously the most rational thing to do is that you should resign now and go and take care of the children now until they can come back to, until they can go back to school, right? And I imagine that a lot of women are in those situations. Like, I know this very close case, and another one is the case of my mom, who she's taking care of her grandchildren because, well, she has more time because she's older than my brother and his wife. So now a lot of older women are taking care of children, but not in this very ideal, romanticized idea of grandmothers taking care of their grandchildren, but it's really an imposition, and it's really a lot of work, right? It's really, and if you think of a woman of 65, more or less, taking care of 2 small kids, it's a lot of work. And now that everything is, you know, on the internet and all of that, I don't know, my mom doesn't know how to use the internet, right? Or these things like, and she doesn't have to know because it's not her responsibility. So I think when we think about the care economy, we should really consider all these things, but also care not only as an obstacle to the participation of women in the economy, but how will this conversation change if we talk about care as a human right? And the right to receive care, because we are all gonna need care when we are old, when we are sick. We all needed care when we were children, right? But also the right to give care to others, because that's also our right. I would say that it's also part of, or it should be my right to take care of my children if I had, or my parents when they are old, it's not just an obstacle for me to participate in the labor market, it's also a right that I should have to decide how to use my time. If I want to use my time working in the labor market, or if I want to use my time taking care of other people that are important to me, right? So how can we understand care as a collective process, that it shouldn't be just a responsibility to the families to solve this thing and to provide the service. But if we think of care about a social process, how would it look like? I still don't know, but I think we should think about it.
Thank you. I think we should think about it too. And we have quite a few questions already coming in. I'll just read some of the comments so far. Someone, I can't see a full name. It says Kebi. I don't know how to, excuse me, I don't know how to like make her name bigger, but she says that she fully agrees with Luby. We need to have a clear draft of what feminists want and then table it to government. And we have quite a few questions related to that, Luby. I wonder if you'll be able to answer it. One is race not the overarching identifier for economic and social exclusion? So do we need to define gender, and does economic and social race already cover it? I imagine based on this conversation, we have already decided that we need to be a lot more intentional with how we include women in economic policies more broadly.
I definitely think we should not be apologetic, because even when we talk about the women in South Africa, especially in the South African context, right, it's the Black women that bears the brunt of all of this, of unemployment, of being disenfranchised. But also, that said, we can't just use race alone. So it might be that we call it a Black feminist movement or whatever, because those two in my head can't be separated, because if you just focus completely on race, you lose other nuances that come with a feminist lens, with an intersectionality lens that looks at things that are beyond, because globally, and even in South Africa, just being female, you still being disadvantaged. But of course, we can't compare the Black female with the white female. It's not the same thing. And those nuances need to come out as well, because we can't also just paintbrush it over as just being feminist, whether you Black or white. And you're right, we need something that speaks to it, and being explicit and unapologetic about being Black and feminist.
And one final question just to add to that, Luby. Someone, Dr. Ntokozo Nzimande, welcome. She asked, to what extent do traditions or religion limits the role of women? And lastly, what could possibly be done from religion or tradition point of view to promote the participation of women?
Whenever I answer this question, I always say sometimes some of the most radical changes we can do as institutions is to look within. So if you're looking at churches, just look at who's heading up the church. Is it a guy? And I know some churches, I don't know if it's still applicable today, where certain women can't assume certain roles within the church. So you look at the church needs to, and religious and cultural organizations, you need to look at your own institution. Who is the voice of that institution? Are you well represented? Do you have women in those spaces that are well represented? Because you can't even come out as a church when you are not transformed yourself to try and put a moral obligation on everyone else to be transformed and to change. So that's the first thing. And in terms of churches and cultural institutions limiting women, this is not an area I'm well versed in, but just from my little experience, I will say, I don't know. I think many churches have made transformation to be more involved and to promote and support women in the working place. But I honestly, I don't know what it is like today, Dr. Ndogozo, and whether or not women, but I think also there are other like societal aspects, which I think for me, besides the church itself, when you're talking about religion, that has made women more outspoken. And I feel like even if the church would be limiting in a certain way, but they still know that, okay, maybe that's what the Bible says, that's a biblical stance, but that shouldn't limit me in my efforts to try and be more active in the economy. But that said, some cultures are very, very much more entrenched in the economic system as well. So this may be maybe not the case in South Africa, but if you look across the continent, in other countries, they might have a more stronger impact and say, because then some countries refer to themselves first in the religion, then the economy, and the economy is highly influenced by the religion and cultural and societal norms of those countries. So I don't have like a set answer on this one, but that would be at the top of my head, my thought.
Wow. Yeah, we've had so many rich discussions and such a rich conversation so far. My final question, because I think it's time for us to round up, my final question will be to both of you. And really it's about, where do we go? Where do we go from here? And Natalia, you spoke about radical transformation. Phoebe, you spoke about crafting strategies that, you know, include women in economic policies and in the economy more broadly. So I know this is a very big question, and perhaps you can answer it in whatever way feels comfortable based on your own work and your own research. But where do we start to begin seeing or implementing the vision that we want? Phoebe, you can go first.
Thanks, Sonia. For me, I haven't seen a lot of almost like a national strategy for South Africa on a recovery plan post-COVID. But that's where, for me, I think as rich economists in this room and this platform, we could start by really drafting that COVID-19 recovery plan. And we all represent very powerful institutions as a collective, and we tabled it in our organizations. We push it forward, we put it in front of government, we monitor how even budget is being allocated to that plan, and hopefully it gets adopted. But I know specifically my organization is really looking at ways of crafting a plan post-COVID, and also from a financing perspective, because that's where we're at, and also a strong stance on incorporating gender. So for me, being surrounded by a group of powerful women, very thought-provokers women, I think we're capable of drafting something really powerful. And people have an appetite, they want those solutions. And it will be that document that's readily available. We give it to our organizations, we put it in front of government, we table it in such platforms like these webinars, Sonia, we start talking about it. And I think amongst all of us, we're definitely capable of coming up at least with like a 20-pager very quickly.
Thank you. And Natalia?
Yes, thank you. Well, I think this is a very challenging moment, and we should really use it, right? Because it's really a good opportunity. Like I hadn't seen so many webinars in my life in which people are really talking about alternatives to neoliberalism. At least I'm not going to say for now alternatives to capitalism, if that sounds like very radical, but at least alternatives to neoliberalism, right? And I think in that way it's exciting, like this whole discussion about the universal basic income and about the universality of public services. I think that's very powerful in this moment, because during neoliberalism these last 30 years or 40 years, we have seen a worsening in the conditions of living of the citizens in general and of the working population as well, specifically, right? How workers have been losing rights and the opportunity to belong to a trade union, to have access to universal public services, right? Like housing, education, food, and healthcare. And I will insist with that because I think that's the basic that we should be fighting for. And even as feminists, I think, of course, being a feminist, we are worried and we are concerned about the experiences of women, but those experiences cannot be separated from race, as you were saying, Luby, and also they cannot be separated from class. So we have to think all the time in three dimensions, like race, gender, and class. And advocate for the minimum economic rights that we need to have right now. So we definitely need to fight for a bigger participation of the government in the economy. That's like I really left this project, if not a very transformative, radical project, at least a project in which the government could deploy some public policies to redistribute income. That's very important right now, that we should see, like, we need policies of redistribution, and we need access to these minimum conditions, minimum rights that ensure our existence as citizens. Because what is the value of being a citizen of a country if that citizenship doesn't come with economic rights, right? If that citizenship doesn't come with the right to you to have a house, to have work, to have food or healthcare. So it's a citizenship just in the paper, right? Not in your lived experience. So what does it mean to be a citizen of any country if you don't have at least access to these very basic conditions of existence? So yes, I would say that redistribution, think about class, gender, and race, and organize collectivities, right, through in these different groups.
Thank you. Yeah, and based on both your contributions on that question in particular, it's clear that we have a long way to go, no doubt, but based on this conversation, and Natalia, as you mentioned, the various conversations that have been surfaced currently since the onset of the pandemic, there's space for contestation, there's space for our alternatives to really surface and come to the fore, whether that be in a document, as you say, Hlubi, or we rally behind bigger alternatives like a universal basic income, which in South Africa, that conversation is really coming forth. And on that note, I'd like to thank both of you for joining, and for everyone else on this call, thank you so much. This is part of a much bigger conversation that we want to have and include as many people as possible so we can push behind these alternatives. The next webinar will build on today's webinar by focusing on the alternatives that have surfaced. We will be looking closely at what a universal basic income is and what opportunities it surfaces for the feminist economy that we want. And so on that note, I'll close the webinar. Thank you all for joining once again, and please do stay in touch.